Welcome to the Myth and Magic Authors Podcast, folklore and fantasy topics aimed at creative storytellers. To write stories and challenge your brain with exciting ideas, delve into these presentations and reflections. See how fantasy realms are based on actual world history, legend, and lore. Study fairy tales, nature fables, and supernaturalism to engage in a jumble of concepts that will trigger your fancy and get you writing imaginatively. Now, here's your host, Neil Mack.
Hello, fantasy fiction fans. I hope you enjoyed last week's show that asked, who was the real St. Valentine? And what do wolves have to do with Valentine's Day? And what are February? And what is the essential ingredient of fantasy? I also explored the Poppins paradox. But today I want to discuss dystopia, and I want to ask, are we living in dystopia right now? In fact, I'll give you a handy checklist of dystopic elements. I'll later discuss the where-ness of your fantasy too, and I'll ask you, where is your when? And also later in the show, I'll discuss what the café de jour is. But first, is dystopia right now? Are we living in dystopia? And I want to later on give you a handy checklist of dystopian elements so that you'll know what subjects to cover in your dystopian fiction project. But I want to start with a story about a snow fight. A few days ago, the citizens here in England were getting very heated and very angered because a group of young people were simply playing in the snow. Like many places in the Northern Hemisphere, we've had quite a bit of snow over the last few weeks. It's a rare occurrence in Britain, and because of that, the kids were delighted to see it and they went out to play. Around the country, there were various similar stories of groups of young people going out to play in the snow. A particular one was picked on by the newspapers and by the media, and they showed you a group which in fact was several hundred youths actually, so many that they outnumbered the police who were sent to get them and grab them about 10 to 1. But they were playing on a hill in northern England, and the same and similar stories were happening around the country. And I must admit, I looked at the pictures and I looked at these sort of outraged headlines of the newspapers, and I thought, what have these kids done wrong apart from defying the COVID rules? Even the COVID rules weren't threatened, because I can't imagine that these children were meeting, because let's be honest, the whole point of sledging and snowboarding and even snowball fighting is that you don't actually meet the other people. It's kind of solo activities. When you're bunging a snowball at somebody, you want to be as far away as possible from them. And after all, these kids were exercising. But people got very upset with these youths. And so it was reported in some newspapers that these kids were irresponsible and their behaviour was unwise. And there's, I suppose, an argument that they could have been injured in the snow when they were playing around, and so therefore they might require medical attention at a time when ambulances and emergency rooms were on the edge of collapse. So I get that. But what I observed was what I think could be defined as a generally discouraging lack of clemency and tolerance by some of the loudest and the most belligerent observers in our society, who seem to object to these kids going outside to enjoy a snow day. What had these kids done that was so wrong, that required so much ire? And after thinking about it for some time, I got my head round the problem. The group on the snowy hill had transformed itself from a bunch of nice, easygoing kids and into a mob. And a mob is the beginning, it's the first element in dystopia. There's a fine line between meeting friends to have a laugh and behaving antisocially. Sometimes, whether you're outside or whether you're inside, you can't see that fine line. So for example, near me, and I live on the riverbank at the River Thames in Surrey, there's a pleasant green with a small sandy beach. And on some sunny days during lockdown last spring, a large number of young people descended on this green. Each and every one of those teens, I'm sure, are lovely, personable and pleasant and agreeable young people. And they weren't there to cause mischief and to cause disturbance. But here's the truth. They did cause a commotion. They did bring loud music. They played boisterous ball games. They slapped their thighs. They screamed and laughed. And they participated in a little bit of partying, I'm sure. They also brought a large amount of snacks and drinks with them. And like other people, they were inclined to leave their litter behind for somebody else to clear up. And here's a thought. If you were an elderly woman, perhaps using a walking frame to get around, and you thought you'd trudge slowly around the block because it's a fine day, I wonder if this group of loud kids would have put you off. I guess, if you were that elderly woman, you'd think it was a mob that you'd walked into. And it's true, obviously, that they could accidentally knock you down because they were running around. They could accidentally throw a ball in your face. They could yell a curse word. Their music would be loud and offensive. Their scant clothing would be unacceptable. And basically their antics could be disturbing if you were an older person. If you were that old woman with the walking frame, you might choose to go on another route, or even worse, you might turn around and go home. And that's the predicament. This group of kids who were just out enjoying themselves weren't trying to be a mob. They weren't there to cause trouble. They just wanted to be with their friends and have fun. They wanted to enjoy their liberty. But their liberty caused another citizen to curtail their liberty. Do you see? So the imposition of one freedom often disturbs or endangers another freedom. And we had a good example of this, didn't we, on our screens when we all witnessed the insurrection in the Capitol building. Now, I don't want to go into politics here. I'm pretty sure the events of the January the 6th probably began with disobedience. And the reason I'm saying that is because dissident, revolutionary and civil libertarian demonstrators shouldn't have been gathering in a large group because there's a deadly pandemic going on. We all know that. And we know that big groups of people are super spreader events. But they gathered anyway. Why? Probably because they wanted to assert their free and liberal right to do whatever they wanted. And incidentally, most media categorise those people as far-right or neo-fascist types, but I think they're pretty liberalistic. They wanted to come together as a group of like-minded, socially populist, freedom-loving people, and they wanted to challenge what they thought was an unacceptable thing that had happened. And so they did come together. Perhaps individually they were, and they are, lovely, pleasant and agreeable persons, just like the kids on the green near me. But they became a mob when they got together, and on this occasion, on the January the 6th, they became a deadly mob. So thinking about all these things and taking all these things together, the snow fight on the hill, the children meeting on the green, and the January the 6th insurrection, I guess it occurred to me that mobs, and especially marauding mobs, are a feature of dystopia. It also occurred to me that dystopia does not require stylised, surreal zombies charging through the streets, nor does it require legions of the undead or lethal cyborg automata. It just requires ordinary people like you and me, who join together as friends, but become, possibly without even knowing, they become a mob. I guess what I'm saying is that the first sign of dystopia is the widespread collapse of all these little systems that we put into place to protect the vulnerable, to protect the people like the old woman who wants to walk past it with her walking frame. Society builds these simple little rules so that things are kept from falling apart. But what happened, and what is happening right now, is that simple little rules are being broken symbolically and almost submissively. And low-level anarchy, and it's only low-level anarchy, it's only people playing with snow on the hill, is bringing frustration and apathy and mistrust. So that's why all the papers were so heated about these children playing snowballs on a hill. It's why the local people near where I live were so heated because some children had gone onto the green to enjoy themselves. And of course on the 6th of January, anarchy brought about some deadly hatred. The mob on the snow-covered hill is one aspect of dystopic signs. It's one aspect that rules are unravelling and that people are fed up with the rules being unravelled, and it's why the newspapers got so annoyed. They got annoyed and their readers got annoyed because it looked as if one part of society was allowed to live as it wanted at the expense of another part of society. So if you're writing a dystopian piece of fiction, don't bother with creating an alternate history, or imagine a Panem-style setting, or invent a fantastic technological advance, or even set your tale post-thermonuclear apocalypse. You don't need to do any of that. Put your story here. Set it up now, because we're currently in dystopia. In that case, I can hear you saying, what's the essential elements of dystopia? So here is my useful list. See how many you can flag up. Number 1, citizens cannot live beyond a precarious hand-to-mouth existence. Next, centuries-old religious views collapse while new and fallacious views are overemphasised. Next, a big government starts to remove liberties from their citizens while remaining above and beyond those same regulations that they impose on their subjects. Next, technocratic corporations begin to control every facet of daily life. Next, Big Pharma is a major player in all events, and citizens can't survive without a dose of medicine. Elites enjoy lavish lifestyles, while plebs have less than they ever had before. Vital technology is operated and owned by the very wealthiest people. Less economic competition means that only a few global corporations are left, and these few global corporations provide everything that anybody needs. There's moral promiscuity, and proper relationships become damaged because of vulgar perversions, and art is valued for sensual pleasure rather than aesthetic enjoyment, and uncontrollable and wealthy oligarchs wield political power, and the big brother state begins to continuously monitor their citizenry, and the natural world is being systematically destroyed, and this leads to an increase in natural disasters and an increase in global epidemics. And centuries-old judicial systems become dysfunctional, and the once reliable political classes also become dysfunctional, and there's a loss or decline of individual distinctiveness or distinctness, so the mob tends to rule rather than the individual. And there's a change from humanness to docile and compliant and easy-influenced sheeple. And the elites use hunger and poverty and disease to hold on to or gain even more power. And the value of life is reduced, so older people seem expendable. And education is deemed insignificant or unproductive, thus it's undermined and devalued. And the elites never work because the work is all done by the plebs, and everyone tries to manipulate and exploit everyone else. And sustainable living and the environment are secondary to maximising short-term profit. And elites blame citizens for catastrophes and for recessions and for conflicts and for panics, but they never take responsibility themselves. And new products are created to maximise profits, but they provide no real value to the consumers. And patriotism and nationalism is considered more important than basic education, reading, writing, arithmetic. And mistrust between religions and between ethnic groups is accommodated because the elites like it. It allows them to accumulate more repressive powers. What are your views on this? Do you agree or do you disagree that we are living currently in a dystopia? And I will also ask you, would you set your next fiction project in the current, in our here and now, dystopian world? Where is the when of your story? In what period should you set your fantasy? Once upon a time. 3 jaded words that should upset any fantasy author worth her salt. It implies that the writer is fixing the events of their story in an imperfect and illusory moment in history, an indefinable moment. But in some unspecified way, it's a moment that we're familiar with. Because I bet if you were a gambler, any story which starts with once upon a time probably takes place in an abstract and spurious, Eurocentric, medieval age, this lurch towards medievalism is probably driven by a conscious desire by writers to emulate our most distinguished predecessors, but especially Tolkien, C.S. Lewis and George R.R. Martin. But it also perhaps stems from an unconscious desire to duplicate the fairy tale world of medieval Europe, which was, of course, personified by Disney. And that Disney medieval fantasy world has a special and magical place in our hearts because we loved it and we were enchanted by it when we were children. So it's natural that we tend to gravitate towards it. Now, I'm not saying, and please don't think I am, that you shouldn't set your fantasy story back in medieval times. If that's what you want to do, I won't stop you. In fact, it's even why I discussed some true medieval insights in my non-fiction manual titled So You Want to Write Fantasy. And I even explored some tangible characters that you might want to use. For example, the true knight and the minstrel and the castellan and the peasant. I wanted to provide you with what I believe is beneficial information about those roles in the hope of suggesting some interesting opportunities for you while at the same time trying to thwart the common misconceptions and the stereotypes that writers often fall into. So, for example, peasants weren't downtrodden morons and kings weren't all-powerful and women, aristocratic women especially, weren't ineffective and helpless. But back to the main point. In what period should you set your fantasy? Well, the easy answer is set it in the period you know best. I'm lucky because I've been here a long time. Tolkien and C.S. Lewis and George R.R. Martin were also older men, like me, who'd seen a lot of life. So, talking just about myself for a second, I can set my adventure in the 1960s, in the 1970s, in the 1980s, or even later. I know all of those periods very well. I lived a lot of life during those decades. And the three authors that I mentioned, Tolkien, Lewis and Martin, were also able to take their own experiences and their own adventures and rediscover and recreate them in their books. And it's what I do too, and it's what I think a lot of my colleagues do. And it's because I know my times well and I know that they are easy for me to replicate. I have a feel for them, and you, of course, have a feel for your time. You know your time well, and you are passionate about your times. But if I tried to place my fiction within an unexplored time zone, in a period in which I did not feel entirely comfortable or familiar with, then it would present me with additional problems over and above the standard task of writing a narrative. And it would become an investigation project. And that's the problem with writing costume dramas, and that's what they are, of course, because the author has to use due diligence in trying to recreate an authentic picture of a world that they've never seen and never been part of. And of course that requires mental work. It takes time, and if you don't do justice to it, then it will become gibberish, and you'll certainly get criticised, and it's a rigmarole. Now, I'm not suggesting for a moment that it's not entertaining and even quite fun to undertake historical research for your novel. But it does take you away from your main task, and that's writing, and writing a good story. So you've got to be a bit careful. You've got to draw the line somewhere. Research becomes a diversion. Research takes you away from the important bit, the writing. So try not to do too much research. Don't get bogged down in research. I guess the hardest part of the writing process is the transformational ability to convince the reader that he or she is reading about a real person, something real, a real place, or a real set of events. And this is what I believe should be called the transpersonal element of fiction. It's the most profound part of it. What we're trying to do is we're trying to use representations and illustrations that are derived from our own imagination, but often from our own experience and consciousness, and then pass it to the reader. So, for example, Tolkien never fought the hordes of Sauron in Mordor, but he did fight in the murderous chaos of the trenches on the Somme during World War I. Similarly, C.S. Lewis never became an adult in just a few weeks after having travelled through a wardrobe and into a magical world, but he did experience trench warfare during the First World War. In fact, he was at the same battle as Tolkien, the Battle of the Somme. And the experience felt as if it lasted much longer than it actually did. It felt like an absence from Earth for weeks, months at a time. In fact, it only lasted 2 or 3 days. So he had travelled in time. He had gone to murderous chaos, and then he was able to explain it in a different way in his fantasy project. And while George R.R. Martin never experienced the long night, he was, nevertheless, a product of the Great Depression. So he knew what it was like to live hand to mouth. And although he was never a sworn brother sent to patrol the wall, he was eligible for conscription in the Vietnam War, and he obtained a conscientious objector status. And because of that, he had to do alternative work as a Vista volunteer for 2 years. What I'm saying is, he patrolled his wall. He did his bit. He speaks from experience. Now, you often hear them say, don't you, write what you know. But to be honest, I think that's utter nonsense. I prefer the thought, write what you're passionate about. And I think Tolkien, and I think Lewis, and I think Martin, they had close scrapes with destruction. They saw barbarism in the eye. They witnessed atrocity. They witnessed inhuman cruelty for themselves. And this is what inspired them. This is what makes them passionate writers. And it's what made their writing unshakable and moving and intense. But let's get back to discussing in what period you should set your fantasy. Have you ever wondered why authors don't set their fantasy during the First World War, or during the Second World War, or during Vietnam, or during the armed invasion of Iraq? I suppose it's because there's an impression that there's already too much going on in times of conflict, and that the people involved in the comings and goings of wartime don't have much time for whimsical or fantastic things. But that's not entirely true. A supernatural entity protected the British Army from defeat at the Battle of Mons in Belgium in August 1914, the same war that Tolkien and Lewis was involved in. There were supernatural archers and an angel that was witnessed by several hundred military personnel. And there were other and quite frequent reports of angelic interventions and ghostly visions, and there was the report of a white cavalry charge in Bethune, and there were many prayer-provoked supernatural events, angels seen during air raids, both on the front line and at home, on the home front. There were visions of crosses in the sky, and many miracles involving chance mists, for example, that came out of nowhere to hide and protect Allied armies. Imagination and fantasy was alive and was very real, even during wartime. Imagination and fantasy doesn't take a day off. It's always there because it's part of the human experience. So in short, what I'm saying is, be credible, be sincere, try to use your own experiences, which I think will make your writing more exciting. Avoid unnecessary research. Set your fantasy in a time period which you are familiar with and you feel comfortable with, or try to establish your story at a critical moment in world history. But above all, be resourceful, be brave, and be inventive. Let me know where your when is, and if you can, try to tweet me at Neilmach, Neilmach, or one word. Good luck! I'm going to spell the word because I'm not 100% sure that I've got my pronunciation right. Ceffyl Ceffyl Dŵr. It's a white-coloured horse, a white water horse from Welsh folklore, and it's the counterpart of this Scottish kelpie. The water horse was a popular image in ancient Rome, a horse with the lower body of a fish, but the upper body of a horse, was a feature of Phoenician, Etruscan, Pictish and Greek mythologies. Poseidon, the god of sea storms and earthquakes and horses, is said to have emerged from the sea before he galloped across the Libyan sand in a chariot drawn by hippocampi. But the main difference between a Ceffyl Dŵr and a hippocampus is that the mythological Welsh water horse does not have fishy features, although it can swim and it can fly. When it's seen by humans, it always resembles a beautiful white horse without any fins and without any flabby bits. In the 1973 book Folklore and Folktales of Wales, author Mary Trevelyan suggests that the Ceffyl Dŵr is a shape-shifting creature that would fly if necessary, depending on the region of the principality in which it was witnessed. So, for example, in North Wales, the beast is depicted as something formidable with fiery eyes and a dark, foreboding presence. And I'll put a picture of the Ceffyl Dŵr on my show notes. While in South Wales, the horse is seen more positively as a luminous and fascinating and sometimes winged steed, like a kind of Pegasus from the water. Ceffyl Dŵr is said to inhabit mountain pools and waterfalls, and although it appears solid, it can evaporate in mist, and often does when it's been seen. In one form of the legend, it's shaped like a horse, but jumps out of the water to trample and kill lone travellers. Another form suggests that the Ceffyl Dŵr could lure an unsuspecting traveller to ride upon it. Flying through the air, the Ceffyl Dŵr will evaporate, dropping the unfortunate rider to his death on the moorland. So, upon discovering a dew-drenched, seemingly intact human body on a high moor, puzzled locals might suggest that the Ceffyl Dŵr threw the poor man down from the clouds. The more likely death scenario, i.e. that the death was caused by harsh environmental conditions, or even more likely substance ingestion, or 100 other more sensible alternatives, were perhaps ignored because they were deemed to be embarrassing or somewhat inconvenient. Ceffyl Dŵr is usually found as a white horse. So the Ceffyl Dŵr of St Illtyd in Oxwich Bay on the Gower Peninsula in Wales, and by the way, Illtyd was the knight abbot, so he was a knight before he became an abbot, and he was possibly connected to the King Arthur legend. He was supposedly the custodian of the Holy Grail. But the Ceffyl Dŵr of St Illtyd is a white horse creature that hides from strangers in a deep well. It is possible that the Ceffyl Dŵr waterhorse is also the lake monster that we know around the world as Nessie, which is another shadowy creature found in deep waters, the deep waters of Loch Ness, which we all know about, but there are other ones in Loch Morar and Loch Lomond in Scotland. The Welsh had their own lake monsters, you see. The best known is Afanc, or Adanc. Afanc is how you should say it, Afanc. A demonic water monster found in a lake near Betws. There is a similar monster at Bala Lake, Llyn Dychydich, and that's in Snowdonia. Bala Lake has developed its own unique ecosystem where they've only recently found a completely new species of fish, so we know that it's a deep and a very, very unusual lake. Curiously, the Royal Navy trained a school of sea lions in this water, and those animals were trained to carry explosives, so that adds to the curiosity value of Bala Lake. Llyn Cawr at Cadaudris is also a bottomless glacial lake, and it's also home to a lake monster. Some Breton and Cornish places, which are connected obviously historically and also mythologically to the people of Wales, those places do tell stories of water horses seen near the ocean, and this of course turns the water horses into sea monsters. The main lakes of Wales and of Scotland are said to be connected to the sea. This hasn't been entirely proven or disproven. It's possible. This means that the monsters that are seen in those huge lakes and lurk in those deep waters may well be the same type of animal as the hippocampi that were observed and known by the ancient civilizations, by the Phoenicians and the Etruscans and the Greeks. And finally, I just want to mention Captain Christmas. In 1846, a guy named Captain Christmas, what a name, of the Danish Navy, reported sighting an enormous long-necked beast pursuing a school of dolphins somewhere between Iceland and the Faroe Islands, and this is just north of Scotland. The captain described the creature as having a horse-like head and a neck as thick as a man's waist, and that it moved gracefully like a swan. What's troubling about this account? And don't forget, this is an account from a trusted source, a man who had presumably seen whales basking, he'd seen seals, he'd seen pods of orcas. He could tell the difference between one type of sea animal and another. He was a trusted witness. But The troubling thing is that the hippocampus that he saw, the sea monster he witnessed, was stalking, by the sound of it, dolphins. And if that's the case, then the water horse that we know as Ceffyl Dŵr is perhaps predatory. Let me know if you have written a story about a water horse or a water monster, or you'd like to know more. Tweet at Neilmach, Neilmach. Good luck with your fantasy fiction project. See you next time.